2 weeks ago, we had Coach Joe Kennedy on the podcast. So let's talk a little bit about his case and Coach Joe Kennedy.
The government's justification for censoring his speech was just not sufficient here in order to overcome Coach Kennedy's free speech rights to pray after the game was over at midfield. So it's a great win that frankly protects the free speech rights of everybody. It's very easy in these free speech cases for people to get caught up in the idea that, well, this just protects people like Coach Joe. There are all kinds of faculty members on university campuses. This is part of our argument in our brief for Americans for Prosperity Foundation. Lots of people who would probably disagree with his exercise of his faith, whose free speech rights were protected because the Supreme Court decided the case in his favor.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for joining us on another edition of American Potential. I'm excited because it's Constitution Week. The United States Constitution, so brilliantly devised by our founding fathers, set forth a government with its checks and balances and separate but equal branches of government. And in my view, it's the most brilliant governing document ever devised by humans. It was revolutionary at the time. And then through the Bill of Rights, it enshrined what our founders laid out as God-given rights that individuals, the people, were entitled to. And it set limits on government so that government couldn't infringe upon those rights. The Constitution was signed on September 17th of 1787 in Philadelphia, and it was the framework of how a central government would operate and the restrictions that would be placed on it. Now, it put restrictions not on citizens, but on government, a brilliant turn of events for the world and for our republic. The Constitution was first ratified in 1791, which gave us the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution has been amended a total of 27 times. On August 29th, 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed a proclamation making September 17th the start of Constitution Week, to take time to celebrate and reflect on the historical act of the Constitution being signed. Now, on today's episode, we're going to talk about the greatness of our Constitution and Constitution Week with Casey Mattox, who's the Vice President of Legal and Judicial Strategy for Americans for Prosperity. Casey, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on. This is great.
Yeah. So, I know you're an attorney. I have always loved the Constitution and just hold it up as such a wonderful document for all of humankind, really, to look to. And there have been other countries that have tried to model what our founders did. Why is it important in your mind to celebrate Constitution Week?
I think the Constitution Day really, and celebrating our Constitution are really sort of undervalued, right? I mean, it almost kind of sneaks up on people. If you think about it at all, it's because you sort of hear about it the morning of Constitution Day or something. Someone mentions it, and it really shouldn't be that way, because really, the Constitution is everything that we think about in terms of the 4th of July and some of the other patriotic holidays that we celebrate about what America is really because of the Constitution itself, right? 4th of July gave us the Declaration of Independence, but we could have gone the path of basically every other country that had existed before us, including the one that we had separated from, and basically won our independence and then immediately put ourselves right back under the power of a king. And that's not what America did. We chose a totally different path, and that path is in our Constitution. And so that really is what makes us the people that we are. Not just having won at Yorktown and won our independence from the British. It's really the fact that we, as you said, we created this governing document that protected individual rights and made sure that we weren't going to be subject anymore to the decisions of one particular person who happened to be in power and claim that divine power. Instead, power actually came from the people themselves. It was the American people that actually gave the government any sort of authority. And we laid out that authority and spelled it out and told government what it could and could not do. That's what makes America so unique. And that's why I think Constitution Day is something that we should all be celebrating a lot more.
So I have this theory that one of the reasons we need to welcome immigrants to the United States is they bring this love and this understanding, I think, of the way it is in other countries, that it's not. I think we just take it for granted sometimes in America. And I look at even my own life. You know, I think it's easy to take things for granted. It's kind of like your health. If you have health, you take it for granted. As soon as you don't have health, you realize how precious health is. Same thing is true with freedom and liberty. But that's what celebrating the Constitution is about, is for people to understand that. How do we do that? How do we make people understand the value and the beauty of this document?
Yeah, you know, it's, I mean, the first thing I would encourage people to do on Constitution Day is to read the Constitution. It's actually not very long. I think people have this assumption that the Constitution is, you know, it's this very long document. I mean, we're a big country, and there's a lot that goes on in our government. Surely a governing document that, you know, sets up our American government must be this, you know, very long document. And it's really not. It's a few thousand words, and it spells out pretty clearly how the system is going to work. So you'll find surprises there. You'll find things that you'll say, boy, it doesn't seem like we actually do it this way. I read what the document says, but it doesn't seem like we actually follow this the way that it says it on paper. You'll find plenty of those situations. And that's it's a constant effort to make sure that the government actually stays within the bounds. But I think the first thing you do is read it. You know, it's a pretty quick read. And, you know, I think there are great resources. The Bill of Rights Institute, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression have some great resources, especially on the First Amendment. There's some great resources to check out that we can put in the notes. And, you know, the Constitution Center in Philadelphia is constantly having just excellent programming. So, you know, I think there's a lot you can do to just remind yourself about the value of the Constitution and why it's so unique.
So let's go over some of the basics of the Constitution. So let's talk about the articles in the Constitution itself. What do the articles establish?
Sure. Basically the Constitution starts, Article 1 starts out with what some people would argue was supposed to be the most important branch of the government. It starts out with the legislative power is vested in Congress. And then it lays out basically how Congress is supposed to be constructed, of the Senate and House of Representatives and how they were to be populated, and the powers that they have. Specifically, what are the specific things that Congress gets to do? The list of things. And they agonized over that list, the list of things. Congress has, of course, expanded that power, and that's the project for all of us as Americans, is to basically remind Congress what it is, what it is actually supposed to be doing. You are the lawmaking branch, not the executive branch, not the administrative state. And two, these are the list of things you're actually empowered to do, not things that aren't on the list. And so that's Article 1. Article 2 is the executive powers of the president. Article 3 is the Supreme Court and the lower courts. So your three branches of government are spelled out right at the very top. And then, of course, as you go on in the articles, you have the rules for how to amend the document. As you mentioned before, 27 times that's been used. It's the brilliance, I think, of the Constitution is the fact that it not only sort of limited government, created this government, but it also assumed that there are going to be things that we need to change, and we're going to put in print exactly how we're going to do that. And so it's really, the longest lasting to date written charter for government that exists in the world. And part of that is because It's so short, it's so simple. It spells out the basic rules, and it says, and here's how we're going to allow those rules to be changed going forward.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing. And by the way, it's not an accident if you read the Federalist Papers and other documents that Article 1 is the legislative branch, right? It would have been the king if they were doing this in Britain, potentially. But they very much wanted that legislative branch to be. They're all separate but equal branches, but they sort of set Article 1 up there. And again, that's not a coincidence that they did that, right?
No, that's right. I mean, those were the people's representatives, right? Yeah. The Constitution begins with "we the people," right? In the preamble, it's "we the people of the United States" in order to form a more perfect union. So we the people are creating this government. That is totally unlike anything else that had happened in the world before. In the past, it's basically someone raised an army, they conquered some people, and because you did the conquering, you and your ancestors, your descendants, get to be the ones who rule over them and tell them how to do things.
Right.
That wasn't our system. We decided, look, the people are the ones who actually get to make the calls, and so we do that through our elected representatives in Congress. That's why it's right up top. I mean, just again, reading through the document can help you to better understand some of these political fights that you see playing out in Washington, D.C. and between Washington and the states. And they can seem sort of, esoteric fights, right? But they're really about, very often, some of these very fundamental principles. Who is supposed to be in charge here? And if it's the American people that are the ones that are in charge, we're supposed to be in charge working through the people that we elect. And that's, it's a key facet of what makes us the country that we are.
The most amazing thing, I think, is the entire concept of that these are rights that government can't take away. And when we talk about the Bill of Rights, of course, when the Constitution was ratified, we got the Bill of Rights. And I want to talk about the First Amendment in just a second. But I want to talk about the idea, which was radical at the time, right, that these aren't rights given by government. The Constitution didn't grant these rights according to our founders. These are God-given rights, the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the other things laid out in the First Amendment we'll talk about in a minute. They were given by God, and the Bill of Rights basically limits government's ability and power to take those rights away from the people, right?
That's right. And at the founding, there wasn't really a debate about whether or not people had those rights that are in the Bill of Rights. The only question was, look, should we spell those out? Or is it better to leave it as it is? Because like James Madison, for example, his first argument was, we don't need to spell out that people have a right to free speech. We didn't give the government the power to regulate speech. So we're already done here. It can only do the things that we gave it the power to do, and we didn't say they could regulate speech, so we're good. But I think what that tells us is, there wasn't really a debate about whether, the two sides about whether or not we needed a Bill of Rights. It wasn't about whether or not people had these rights, because as you said, the founders understood that these rights were not something that the Constitution was giving us. They were something the Constitution was acknowledging that we already had. Mm-hmm. And again, that's a big change. If you think about kings for thousands and thousands of years, you didn't have rights against the king. The king was, God's representative on earth. And what the Constitution is saying is, no, you have that backwards. It's the people that have rights from their creator. And they are telling government, you don't have the ability to take that away from us. We're giving government some power, but we're not giving you power over fundamental rights. That's a totally different way of understanding how government is supposed to work. And it's why when you talk to a constitutional lawyer like myself, we can get really picky about this point. We'll see things all the time where people talk about how the First Amendment gives us the right to, and most constitutional lawyers will start to bristle at that suggestion. It's a common misstatement, but it's a really, really important principle.
Yeah. Well, and I think the follow-on part to that is that the Bill of Rights then goes on and limits government and says government cannot do these things that would take away these freedoms. And it's just revolutionary. It was revolutionary at the time, and it really has allowed freedom and liberty to flourish in America.
That's right. It's basically a belt and suspenders approach, right?
Yeah.
Article 1 says these are the things government gets to do, and restricting your rights is not on that list. And they said, okay, well, just to be absolutely clear, we're going to put down a list of things, and then put a provision in that says we're not even limiting it to that list in the Ninth Amendment. But basically, this is a list of stuff that, just to be absolutely clear, you can't transgress people's free speech rights, their free exercise of religion rights, all of those sorts of things, right? All that is laid out in the Bill of Rights. Yeah.
Let's talk about the First Amendment. Most people, when they hear the First Amendment, I don't know what percentage of Americans would just say, well, that's freedom of speech, because that's what people tend to think about. Maybe some would say, well, there's also freedom of religion in there, but it actually lays out several. Let's talk about those. What are the freedoms that are recognized as individuals having in the First Amendment?
Sure. So the First Amendment prohibits the establishment of a state religion. It protects free exercise of religion, protects free speech, freedom of the press, which we can maybe return to in a second, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition the government for grievances. And I mentioned the press point because it's one that I think, our modern ears especially, right? You hear all those words and it's difficult to not read in the way that we understand them now. I think one of the interesting things at the time of the First Amendment, there was no Washington Post, there was no New York Times, there was nothing like that. And so at the time of the founding, freedom of the press was not just the ability for, incorporated newspaper companies to ask questions of the president and then print them and distribute them. That was the ability of people to mass communicate ideas, and it was a protection that was available to individual people, to the news media, to create books and publish books and pamphlets and all those sorts of things that had actually been critical at the time of the founding. So, but those are your protections, specific protections in the First Amendment.
Yeah, and it encompasses so much, and it's so brilliantly written that, frankly, as our world has changed, and, you talked about what freedom of press may have meant then, maybe means something radically different today, right? I mean, freedom of the press, does that extend to the internet? Does it extend to platforms such as,
Right.
what people say on Twitter, freedom of speech, things like that? It was so brilliantly written, though, that it's stood the test of time, hasn't it?
It really has, and it's because it's the principles that matter. And for people like me, like many of us who are originalists, textualists, but especially originalists when you think about the Constitution, the real question is, when the Constitution was adopted, when something like the First Amendment was adopted, what did not just the people who wrote it, but the people themselves, because they were the ones that the power was coming from. What did they understand that they were this government that they were creating, these rights that the government was being forced to acknowledge? What did they understand about that? Because they were the ones that the power was coming from. And so that's the question you ask, and then the way to think through that is basically, well, what are the principles? And as you said, those principles can change over time. Obviously, Twitter or X or whatever we're going to call it now didn't exist at the time of the founding, but that doesn't mean that those free speech rights, were unprotected just because it didn't exist. It's basically the enduring principles that remain from those, from the Constitution, especially from those amendments to the Constitution that continue to apply going forward up until today.
Let's walk through a real world example of the First Amendment and how it would be applied here, because I think it's a fair point. I think a lot of people would just look at it and say, well, that means the First Amendment and freedom of speech means that I can say what I want on Facebook, or I can say what I want on X, formerly known as Twitter. That isn't what the First Amendment says. So a platform, a company like X or Facebook has the right to decide what they want to allow on their platform. But walk us through, and there have been some court cases recently where they've tried to limit, through government has put pressure on some of those platforms to say, well, we don't want them to say this, so we want you to censor this. That's really the difference here, and that's where it starts violating the First Amendment. Am I right on that?
That's exactly right. So it's very important, right? We think through, most people, I think, when you are aware of even what the First Amendment protects, even if you're aware of the different things that the First Amendment protects, what you can miss is the very, very first words of the First Amendment, which is Congress shall make no law.
Right.
It doesn't say Elon Musk shall make no policy. It doesn't say Mark Zuckerberg shall make no policy, right? It says Congress shall make no law. And that's very important because the Constitution, virtually all of the Constitution, with the exception of the 13th Amendment, the entire Constitution is basically aimed at restricting what government does, not at restricting individuals or anyone else, right? So I have the free speech right, or I have the ability to tell my son, that he has to play the quiet game, right? I'm not violating his free speech rights.
Right.
Much in the same way, if government comes in and tries to tell social media platforms that, this is how they have to construct their websites and what content they are either forced to have on their platforms or not permitted to have on their platforms, or even to coerce them. You mentioned recent decision, Missouri versus Biden. This is a very important case where basically the allegation, and there's a lot of evidence in the record in this case, is that the Biden administration, a number of officials in the Biden administration, were pressuring social media companies to take down content that they thought was either critical of the Bidens, was contrary to the administration's position on COVID questions, sort of misinformation type questions and things like that. And they pressured the platforms. And the platforms would keep coming back to them time and time again saying, but this doesn't violate our policies. And the administration would essentially indicate that, well, if you don't do something about it, we may have to do something to you. And the platforms would eventually sort of back down from that and change their policies. And now the federal district court, and then just this past week, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals held that violated the First Amendment and issued an order stopping the Biden administration from pressuring social media companies to take down content. Now, if those platforms had decided on their own, right? If Elon Musk had completely on his own decided, I don't like people saying X on this platform, and so I'm going to start taking down tweets that make that argument or make that statement. He could do that. It's his platform. He's not Congress. He has the power to do that, and that's his own free speech right. But when the administration, when the government comes in and starts pressuring the social media companies, that's where the First Amendment does its work and prohibits that sort of government pressure because of those very first words in the First Amendment.
Right. Yeah. And it's really good. I'm glad that we were able to go through that and explain the difference there, the nuance there. But it really is, again, the First Amendment is prohibiting government action which will infringe upon these rights. Now, we've had a number of Supreme Court cases dealing with free speech over the last couple of years, landmark cases. 2 weeks ago, we had Coach Joe Kennedy on the podcast. So let's talk a little bit about his case and Coach Joe Kennedy.
Yeah, that's a significant decision this past term, and it really is we filed a brief in that case from Americans for Prosperity Foundation, in support of my good friends over at First Liberty, who brought that case to the court. So, Coach Joe, I'm sure for your listeners who hopefully watched the podcast or listened to the podcast before, but he was a high school football coach, was sanctioned for having prayed after a football game, and so ended up taking that case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court held that the school district there had violated his First Amendment rights. And it really raises sort of an interesting, kind of two at least interesting questions. One is religious speech in the First Amendment. There's always this sort of argument. Much of my career has been spent litigating sort of religious speech cases around the First Amendment, free exercise cases in the First Amendment. There's always an argument from government that they try to make that, well, if it sounds a little religious, then doesn't it sort of almost kind of violate the Establishment Clause? And once you get close to violating the Establishment Clause, the government can avoid violating the Establishment Clause by censoring your religious speech. That's almost always at least one argument in the government's pocket. And the court rejected that here. This doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. The other argument in this case is, well, he's a government official. And so this is public employee speech, and government has more power to try to restrict the speech that someone who is employed by the government is making. And the court likewise rejected that argument, at least in the facts of this case. The government's justification for censoring his speech was just not sufficient here in order to overcome Coach Kennedy's free speech rights to pray after the game was over at midfield. So it's a great win that frankly protects the free speech rights of everybody. It's very easy in these free speech cases for people to get caught up in the idea that, well, this just protects people like Coach Joe. There are all kinds of faculty members on university campuses. This is part of our argument in our brief for Americans for Prosperity Foundation. Lots of people who would probably disagree with his exercise of his faith, whose free speech rights were protected because the Supreme Court decided the case in his favor. And that's how these constitutional rights generally work. Defending one person's constitutional rights protects constitutional rights for everybody.
Yeah. Well, one of the things when I was talking to Coach Joe that really struck me is when the school district told him, well, we'd prefer you didn't, we're telling you can't pray on the field, right, but it would be okay if you went into a broom closet or a janitor's closet and prayed there. And I just thought to myself, what lawyer for the school district thought, well, I'll bet you that's what our founders meant when they drafted the First Amendment, was to make sure that people were taking their religious faith or their ideas and going into a janitor's closet where they could exercise them. That is not what our founders believed when they wrote the First Amendment, right?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, that's the beauty of the First Amendment, is that it makes it very clear that we have the ability to live out our faith, our beliefs in public, and that those are protected by the First Amendment.
Now, what about this, the other case, the 303 Creative, I think is what the case was called, out of Colorado. I'm from Colorado. It seems like all of these cases come from Colorado. It seems we had the Baker case a few years ago. But this case was a landmark case as well for religious liberty.
No, that's exactly right. So this is 303 Creative is the follow-on to the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. Likewise, good friends at Alliance Defending Freedom who brought this case to the Supreme Court. And it's basically a woman who does websites, designs individual websites, and she wanted to start designing websites for weddings. And some of you have probably seen a lot of these where you can go and find out what's on the registry and all that kind of information about the wedding. So she wanted to start doing websites to celebrate weddings, but Colorado has its Anti-Discrimination Act, the same one that came up in the Jack Phillips case, Masterpiece Cake Shop. And what that would have done would have required her, if you're going to start doing weddings, you have to do same-sex weddings also. And you are prohibited from posting anything on your website that says, that you don't even prefer to do those types of websites. And so she objected to doing websites in the same-sex wedding context, wanted to be able to do websites more generally in the wedding context. And so they filed suit, challenged the law as it would apply to her. Colorado agreed that, yes, it would definitely apply this law to her in this way, that what she was seeking to do would violate the Colorado law. The 10th Circuit, the Federal Court of Appeals over Colorado, said, well, look, you have a monopoly on your own. Like, yes, we agree that there are plenty of people who could do these websites. Frankly, it doesn't even have to be in Colorado. When you're talking about website design, it could be any website designer all over the world could design a website for you. You don't have to go in and to a brick and mortar place for that. But you have a specific ability to design websites like Lori Smith. Lori Smith has Lori Smith websites. And so you can't, if Colorado has the power to be able to require you to provide those websites, because everyone has to have access to websites just as you would create them. It really kind of flips the whole notion of, the uniqueness of your ability suddenly becomes a tool that the government can use against you, and say, well, because of your artistic ability, you have to provide that artistic ability to everyone. And the government has the power to compel you. Supreme Court rejected that argument. And in a pretty landmark decision in the 303 Creative case, the Supreme Court said that a law like Colorado's cannot be used by the government to compel people to say things that they don't believe. And that's a significant win for the First Amendment, and one that I think we will see reverberate going forward.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you back, Casey, to get in more detail about some of these free speech, free exercise of religion cases and things like that. Now, on that one, I want to play devil's advocate, because there's a lot of people when that case, the 303 Creative case, came out, who basically said, well, the court just said that you can be hateful and you can just decide you're not going to serve a certain person. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, what the court didn't say, because the court actually took that question on too. Yeah. And what the court said is, look, anti-discrimination laws have existed for a long time alongside the First Amendment, and they can continue to exist alongside it. What you can't do is this is a pretty unique new use of non-discrimination laws like this to compel people to speak, not just to provide a service. This isn't like, telling an innkeeper you must allow people to stay at your inn, which was the sort of old the common example of what these kinds of laws were aimed at doing. It's a totally different thing when you're saying you have to create custom expressive services for people. So I think that's the big difference here. When you're asking people to speak, not just to provide a service, but to actually speak, create content, create words. That's where the First Amendment comes into play. So, I think the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act is still in force. It is still going to apply in virtually every circumstance, except for ones where Colorado would try to force people to say things. And that's what the Supreme Court said you can't do. Right.
Well, I know we're almost out of time. We haven't even gotten through all of the freedoms in the First Amendment, let alone the Second Amendment, Third, and all the rest of the Bill of Rights. And so I'd love to have you come back and we can get into some of those in later episodes of the show. But for the purpose
I'm looking forward to, and I think all of your listeners would love a Third Amendment episode. We desperately need an entire. We should spend a half of an hour on the idea that the government cannot order troops in your home during peacetime. That is entertainment.
Maybe, Casey, that would be a minute or 2 minute podcast episode on the third. But then we'll get into the Fourth Amendment, and then it'll get exciting.
So far, we're undefeated at that. The government has has never violated the Third Amendment, as far as I'm aware. So that's great.
That's great. The only one that the government has never.
That's right.
The government has never violated. What? Just real quick. I know, obviously, as we are going into Constitution Week, what are some of the ways people can celebrate Constitution Week? You talked about reading the Constitution. That's so important. But what are some of the ways that they can celebrate?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to actually put up a Constitution Day music playlist that I'm working on right now. Hopefully by the time this comes out, we can get you a link to Constitution Day playlist, right?
That'd be great.
So, yeah, no, I think there's, frankly, I think reading it, checking out some of the links that we will put in the show notes that give you, connections to some of the other content that people have put together on helping people understand the Constitution and appreciate just the uniqueness of this document that has really made this country.
Yeah, it is. It's just such a special moment when this Constitution was adopted, and not just for America, for the world. I mean, the world really has benefited by this recognition that these rights are bestowed upon us, and government doesn't have the right to take them away. So thanks, Casey. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
We are so blessed to be governed by the Constitution, which says the government can't govern us in the way that sometimes government would like to govern us. What an incredible document. And I would just encourage everybody to read the Constitution. It's so easy to find. Google U.S. Constitution and read it. Take some time this week to read it. You know, Ronald Reagan, who's my political hero, Ronald Reagan once said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free." Now, I hope that never happens. I hope that we never come across that day. And as I say time and time again, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Understand the rights granted to you in the Constitution. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.